Welcome, dear listener, to this gentle telling of one of humanity's most enduring tales, the journey of Odysseus across wine-dark seas toward home. As you settle into comfort and prepare for rest, let this ancient story carry you through moonlit waters and distant shores, where gods walked among mortals, and every wave held both wonder and wisdom. If you find peace in these quiet historical journeys, your kindness in sharing them helps bring more such stories to life, like gentle lights guiding others toward restful sleep. Now, close your eyes and drift with me across 3,000 years to where our story begins. The sun hung low over the plains of Troy, casting long shadows across a battlefield that had known 10 years of war. The great city's walls, once proud and impenetrable, lay broken like scattered stones on a beach after a storm. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from the ruins, carrying with it the end of an age and the beginning of countless stories that would echo through time. Among the Greek warriors who walked through the fallen city, one man's thoughts had already turned toward home. Odysseus of Ithaca, king of a small island kingdom in the Ionian Sea, stood before the smouldering remains of Troy's great gates. His weathered hands rested on the pommel of his sword, but his mind sailed across distant waters toward rocky shores where olive trees grew silver in the Mediterranean sun, where his wife Penelope waited with their young son, Telemachus. The clever king had played his part in Troy's fall. It was his mind that conceived the great wooden horse, that final stratagem that brought victory when strength alone couldn't. Now, as ash fell like snow around him, Odysseus felt only weariness and a longing so deep it seemed to pull at his very soul. He had been away from Ithaca for 10 long years, and every fibre of his being yearned for the familiar comfort of home. The harbour of Troy bustled with activity as the Greek fleet prepared for departure. Ships that had carried warriors to war now loaded treasure and memories of victory. Odysseus gathered his loyal crew of Ithacans, men who had followed him faithfully through the long siege, men who shared his hunger for home. Their ship, sleek and swift, bobbed gently in the harbour like a seabird eager to take flight. As they prepared to sail, the other Greek leaders bid their farewells. Agamemnon, the High King, embraced Odysseus with the weary relief of one who had carried too great a burden for too long. Menelaus, for whose wife this war had been fought, clasped his hand with gratitude. But it was old Nestor, wise in years and counsel, who spoke the words that would prove most prophetic. "The war is won, Odysseus," the old king said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "But the journey home may prove longer than any of us expect. The gods have their own designs, and mortal plans are but threads in their greater tapestry." Odysseus nodded respectfully, but in his heart burned only the desire to see Ithaca's shores again. He could almost taste the salt air of his homeland, could almost hear Penelope's voice calling his name. How could he know that Nestor's words held more truth than anyone could imagine, that his journey home would become a tale told around hearth fires for generations uncounted? The morning they departed, Troy dawned clear and bright, with winds that filled their square sail and sent them dancing across the waves. The crew sang as they rowed, their voices rising and falling with the rhythm of the oars cutting through blue water. Odysseus stood at the stern, watching Troy disappear behind them until it was nothing more than a smudge of smoke on the horizon. For several days they sailed in high spirits. The weather held fair, and their course seemed true. At night they would beach their ship on friendly shores and feast on wine and roasted meat, telling stories of the war and dreaming of home. Odysseus would sit apart sometimes, his eyes fixed on the stars that wheeled overhead, using their ancient patterns to navigate not just across the sea, but toward the life that waited for him. But the gods, as Nestor had warned, had their own designs. On the 10th day after leaving Troy, a storm arose from nowhere, as if summoned by divine will. The sky, which had been clear blue moments before, filled with clouds the color of old bronze. The wind, which had been their faithful companion, turned wild and treacherous, howling like wolves around their mast and sail. Odysseus ordered his men to secure everything that could be moved, to check the ropes and prepare for rough weather. But this was no ordinary storm. The waves rose like moving mountains, their crests white with foam that stung like salt tears. The ship climbed each massive wave, only to plunge into the trough beyond. And with each rise and fall, the crew could feel themselves being driven farther and farther from their intended course. For 3 days and nights the storm raged with divine fury. The men took turns at the oars, fighting to keep the ship's head pointed into the waves, while others bailed water that sloshed over the sides with each violent pitch and roll. Odysseus stood at the steering oar, his hands raw from gripping the wooden handle, his eyes red with salt spray and exhaustion. He had navigated storms before, but nothing like this tempest that seemed to have a will of its own. When the storm finally broke, it left them in waters they did not recognize, under skies that seemed somehow different. The stars, when they appeared that first clear night, were in patterns that made Odysseus frown and check his calculations again and again. They had been driven far from any course he knew, into seas that existed on no map he had ever seen. The next morning brought them to a land that seemed to float in morning mist like something from a dream. The shore was lined with flowers of colors so vivid they seemed to glow in the gentle sunlight. Lotus blossoms, larger and more beautiful than any they had ever seen, carpeted the hills that rolled back from the sea, like green waves frozen in time. The men were exhausted from their battle with the storm, and the sight of this peaceful shore filled them with relief. Odysseus, though cautious by nature, could see no threat in this gentle land. He chose 3 of his most trusted companions to go ashore and explore, to find fresh water and perhaps food to supplement their dwindling stores. The 3 men rowed to shore in the ship's small boat, their oars barely disturbing the mirror-smooth water of the harbor. As they pulled the boat onto the beach, they were greeted by people unlike any they had ever encountered. The Lotus-Eaters, as they came to be known, were beings of serene contentment, their faces peaceful as summer afternoons, their movements slow and graceful as dancers in a dream. These gentle folk welcomed the strangers with open arms, offering them food and drink without question or price. The food they shared was the lotus fruit, sweet beyond description, with a taste that seemed to hold all the flavors of paradise. The three Greeks ate gratefully, their sea-weary bodies absorbing the nourishment like flowers drinking morning dew. But as they ate, something strange began to happen. The memories of home that had driven them across the sea started to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. The faces of loved ones became unclear. The urgency of their journey seemed less important with each bite of the magical fruit. Time itself seemed to slow and stretch like honey in the sun. Hours passed, then days, and still the three men didn't return to the ship. Odysseus paced the deck, his concern growing with each hour. The crew watched the shore anxiously, seeing their companions moving dreamily among the Lotus-Eaters, but showing no sign of remembering their mission or their desire to return home. Finally, Odysseus could wait no longer. Taking several of his strongest men, he rowed to shore himself. He found his three companions sitting in a circle with the Lotus-Eaters, their eyes distant and peaceful, lotus flowers woven into their hair. When he called to them, they looked at him with mild confusion, as if trying to remember who he was and why his voice carried such urgency. With gentle but firm hands, Odysseus and his men lifted their comrades and carried them back to the ship, even as they protested weakly that they wished to stay in this land of perpetual peace. The Lotus-Eaters made no move to stop them, only watched with their serene smiles as the foreigners departed their timeless shore. Once back on the ship, Odysseus ordered the anchor raised immediately. As they sailed away from the land of the Lotus-Eaters, the three men who had tasted the magical fruit wept, their memories of home returning slowly, like tide creeping up a beach. They looked back at the receding shore with longing, and for many nights afterward, they would speak of the perfect peace they had found there and lost. As they sailed on through waters that grew progressively stranger, Odysseus reflected on their narrow escape. He understood now that the journey home would test them in ways the war had never done. Troy had threatened their bodies, but these new dangers reached for their souls, their very sense of who they were and what drove them forward. The next morning brought them to a very different sort of shore. Where the land of the Lotus-Eaters had been soft and welcoming, this new coast was harsh and forbidding. Cliffs rose like walls from the sea, their faces scarred with caves that looked like empty eye sockets staring out at the water. This was the land of the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants who knew neither law nor hospitality. Odysseus chose to explore this threatening shore himself, taking only 12 of his bravest men. They beached their boat in a small cove and climbed the rocky path that led to the largest of the caves. The opening was enormous, easily large enough for a giant to pass through. And from within came the sound of bleating sheep and goats. The cave was a marvel to behold. Its ceiling soared high above their heads, disappearing into shadows, while the floor was scattered with the tools and implements of a shepherd, all made to a scale that dwarfed normal men. Stone bowls large enough for a man to bathe in sat beside the walls, and wheels of cheese, each one as large as a shield, aged on wooden shelves. Odysseus's men urged him to take what they could carry and leave immediately, But their king's curiosity was stronger than his caution. This was clearly the home of one of the legendary Cyclopes, and he wished to see such a creature with his own eyes, perhaps to receive the gifts that custom demanded a host should give to visitors. They did not have long to wait. As the sun began to set, the ground trembled with heavy footsteps, and through the cave mouth came the most enormous being any of them had ever seen. Polyphemus, son of the sea-god Poseidon, was a mountain of a creature, standing twice the height of a tall man, with shoulders broad as a ship's beam. But most striking of all was his face, which held only one eye, great and round, set in the center of his forehead, like a baleful moon. The giant drove his flock of sheep into the cave before him, each animal large as a small horse, their bells creating a symphony that echoed from the stone walls. Only when the last sheep had entered did Polyphemus notice the strangers huddled in the shadows of his home. His single eye fixed upon them with the cold intelligence of a predator. When he spoke, his voice was like grinding millstones, like rock slides in mountain passes. "Little men," he rumbled, "who are you to enter my home uninvited? Are you traders sailing the sea roads, or are you pirates bringing harm wherever you wander?" Odysseus stepped forward, his natural eloquence serving him even in this moment of danger. He spoke of their journey from Troy, of their wish for hospitality as custom demanded, and of their hope for the giant's friendship. But as he spoke, he saw something terrible growing in that single eye. Not friendship, but hunger. "Stranger," Polyphemus replied, his voice carrying a threat like distant thunder. "You ask me to honor the gods and their laws of hospitality. But we Cyclopes care nothing for Zeus or his commandments. We are a law unto ourselves, and I will show you what mercy to expect from me." Without warning, the giant's massive hand shot out and seized two of Odysseus's men. What followed was too terrible to describe in detail, for the giant was not merely hostile. He was a cannibal who viewed the intruders as nothing more than a convenient meal. The cave filled with the sounds of horror, and the remaining men could only watch in paralyzed terror as their companions met their fate. When his grisly meal was finished, Polyphemus lay down across the cave entrance, his massive body blocking the only way out. Soon his snores echoed through the cavern like distant thunder, but the trapped men found no rest. They huddled together in the darkness, knowing that morning would bring fresh horrors. Odysseus's mind raced through the long night, turning over plan after plan, rejecting each in turn. They could not overpower the giant. He was far too strong. They could not slip past him. His body filled the cave mouth completely. Even if they could somehow kill him in his sleep, his corpse would trap them just as effectively as his living form. But as dawn light began to filter into the cave, illumination came to Odysseus's mind, as well as to the world outside. Near the back of the cave lay an enormous staff of olive wood, cut by the giant, but not yet carved to his use. It was as thick as a ship's mast, and taller than any tree that grew in mortal lands. Working quietly while the giant still slept, Odysseus and his men used their swords to cut off a section of the staff. They sharpened one end to a wicked point, then hardened it in the embers of the giant's fire, until it was like iron. When their weapon was ready, they hid it beneath pails of sheep dung, and waited for their chance. That morning Polyphemus awoke and repeated his horrible routine. 2 more of Odysseus's companions vanished into the giant's maw, and again the Cyclops rolled the great stone across the cave entrance before departing with his flock. But this time Odysseus and his remaining men were ready. When evening brought the giant home again, Odysseus approached him with a skin of wine he had brought from their ship. Wine so strong and sweet it could make even gods marvel at its taste. He offered it to Polyphemus as a gift, speaking humbly of his desire to make amends for trespassing in the giant's home. The Cyclops had never tasted such wine. It was like liquid fire and honey combined, warming his great body and clouding his thoughts with pleasant dreams. He drank deeply, then demanded more, his single eye growing bright with intoxication. "Little man," he rumbled, his words beginning to slur, "this wine is worthy of the gods themselves. Tell me your name, that I might know who has given me such a gift. In return, I will give you a gift of my own. I will eat you last of all your companions." Odysseus smiled, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge of what must come. "My name," he said, "is Nobody. Nobody is what my father called me, and nobody is what all men know me as." The giant laughed, a sound like boulders tumbling down a mountainside. "Then, Nobody," he said, "you shall indeed be the last I devour." And with that he collapsed into wine-heavy sleep, his snores shaking dust from the cave ceiling. Now came the moment Odysseus had planned for. He and his men retrieved their great spear from its hiding place and thrust its point deep into the embers of the fire until it glowed like a star. Then, lifting it together, they approached the sleeping giant. What they did next was necessary but terrible, for they drove the burning point directly into the Cyclops' single eye. The giant's screams shook the very mountains as he thrashed in agony, but the deed was done. When he finally calmed enough to speak, he called out to his fellow Cyclopes who lived in nearby caves. "Brothers," he roared, "come quickly. I am dying. Nobody is killing me." The other giants gathered outside his cave, their voices rumbling with concern. "Brother Polyphemus," they called, "if nobody is harming you, then there is nothing we can do. Perhaps Zeus has sent you a sickness. Pray to your father Poseidon for healing." And with that, they returned to their own caves, leaving the blinded giant alone with his rage and pain. But though their enemy could no longer see them, he was far from helpless. Polyphemus rolled away the stone that blocked the cave entrance, then sat in the opening with his massive arms spread wide, feeling for any who might try to escape. The sheep milled about the cave, bleating their desire to reach the pastures outside, but their master would not let them pass without checking each one carefully. Once again, Odysseus's clever mind found a solution where strength could not prevail. The giant's sheep were large and woolly, their fleece hanging in great curls beneath their bellies. Working carefully in the darkness, Odysseus tied his men beneath the largest rams, binding them securely with willow withes so they hung hidden in the warm wool. When morning came, and the sheep pressed toward the cave entrance, eager for their daily grazing, Polyphemus felt each animal carefully as it passed. His hands ran over their backs and sides, but he never thought to check beneath them. One by one, Odysseus's men passed to safety, carried by the unsuspecting flock. Odysseus himself chose the largest ram of all, a magnificent creature whose wool was like clouds touched by sunset. Clinging to its belly, he felt the giant's hands pass over the animal's back as they had the others. But this ram was Polyphemus's favorite, and the giant spoke to it softly. "My sweet ram," he murmured, "why are you last to leave today? Usually you lead the flock to pasture, and are first to return. Are you grieving for your master's eye, taken by that wretch Nobody and his cursed companions? If only you could speak and tell me where he hides, I would dash his brains against these rocks and find some ease for my pain." But the ram, loyal though it was, carried its hidden burden safely past the giant's grasping hands. Once outside, Odysseus quickly freed himself and his men, and together they drove the finest of the flock toward their ship. The stolen sheep would provide food for many days, and their escape had been accomplished without further loss of life. As they loaded the animals aboard their vessel and prepared to depart, Odysseus felt the pride of victory burning in his chest. They had faced a monster and emerged triumphant through wit and courage. But pride, as he would learn, can be a more dangerous enemy than any giant. Unable to resist taunting his defeated foe, Odysseus called out across the water as their ship pulled away from shore. "Cyclops," he shouted, "if any man asks who blinded you, tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." This boast would prove to be one of the greatest mistakes of his life. For Polyphemus, hearing his tormentor's true name, raised his hands towards the heavens and called upon his father, Poseidon, lord of the sea. "Father," the giant prayed, "if I am truly your son, grant me this revenge. Let Odysseus never reach his home, or if the fates decree he must, let him arrive late and alone, after losing all his companions, and let him find trouble waiting in his house." Poseidon heard his son's prayer, and the sea god's anger would follow Odysseus like a storm cloud for years to come. But for now, the wind filled their sail and carried them away from the land of the Cyclopes, while behind them the blinded giant hurled boulders that fell just short of their stern, sending great waves that pushed them even faster toward the open sea. Days passed in relative peace as they sailed through waters that grew gradually more familiar. The encounter with Polyphemus had shaken them all, but they had sheep to eat and wine to drink, and the wind seemed to favor their journey. Odysseus began to hope that the worst of their trials was behind them. Their next landfall brought them to an island that seemed to rise from the sea like a green jewel. Aiaia, as it was known, was home to Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios, a sorceress whose knowledge of herbs and magic was beyond that of mortal women. The island was beautiful beyond description, with meadows that bloomed in eternal spring and groves where every tree bore fruit. As their ship approached the harbor, they could see smoke rising from somewhere inland, suggesting human habitation. After their recent experiences, Odysseus was more cautious about exploration. He climbed to the highest point on the shore and studied the island carefully, noting the lay of the land and the safest approaches. From his vantage point, he could see a palace of polished stone nestled in a valley where streams flowed like silver threads through gardens of otherworldly beauty. The sight was so lovely it made his heart ache with longing, for it reminded him of descriptions he had heard of the blessed islands where heroes went after death. Deciding that exploration was necessary but caution was wise, Odysseus divided his men into 2 groups. He would lead one group, while his dear friend Eurylochus led the other. They would draw lots to see who would venture inland first. The lot fell to Eurylochus, and so 22 men set off toward the mysterious palace, leaving Odysseus and the remainder of the crew to guard the ship. The path to Circe's palace wound through groves where strange flowers bloomed, blossoms that seemed to glow with their own light and release fragrances that made the men feel dreamy and content. As they walked, wild animals emerged from the forest to watch them pass. But these were no ordinary beasts. Lions and wolves approached without fear or aggression, their eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. The animals followed them like friendly dogs, and the men noticed with growing unease that many of these creatures bore expressions of terrible sadness, as if they remembered being something other than what they now appeared to be. The palace itself was a marvel of architecture and beauty. Its walls were built from stones that seemed to capture and hold sunlight, making them glow with warm radiance. Gardens surrounded the building, filled with herbs and flowers whose names were known only to those versed in ancient magic. And from within came the sound of singing. A woman's voice raised in a melody so beautiful it seemed to make the very air shimmer. Eurylochus approached the great doors with his men behind him, their hands instinctively checking their weapons despite the peaceful atmosphere. When they called out, requesting the hospitality due to travelers, the singing stopped, and soon the doors opened to reveal their hostess. Circe appeared before them like a vision from a dream. She was tall and graceful, with hair that caught light like spun gold and eyes that held the depth of ancient wisdom. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same one they had heard singing, melodious and warm, with undertones that seemed to resonate in their very bones. "Welcome, noble travelers," she said, her smile bright as morning sunlight. "I am Circe, mistress of this island. You must be weary from your journey across the wine-dark sea. Come, enter my halls and refresh yourselves with food and drink." The palace interior was even more beautiful than its exterior suggested. The halls were filled with tapestries that seemed to move and change in the shifting light, depicting scenes of gods and heroes, of transformations and magical journeys. Servants, beautiful as their mistress, moved silently about their duties, preparing a feast for the unexpected guests. Circe led them to a great hall where tables were already laden with delicacies beyond imagination. There were fruits that seemed to glow with inner light, bread that smelled of honey and flowers, and wine that sparkled like liquid stars. The goddess herself served them, moving among the men with pitcher and cup, ensuring that each was well supplied with the magical feast. But Eurylochus, always the most cautious of Odysseus's companions, held back from the revelry. Something about their hostess troubled him, though he could not say exactly what. Perhaps it was the way the servant women moved without casting shadows, or how the wine seemed to shift color in the cup, or the fact that those lions and wolves outside had looked at them with such intelligent sorrow. As he watched, hidden in an alcove near the hall's entrance, Eurylochus saw Circe approach each of his companions with a cup of wine that sparkled differently from all the rest. This wine seemed to hold captured moonlight, and as each man drank, a change came over his features, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Their faces began to alter, growing longer and more bestial. Hair sprouted from their skin, and their hands became hooves. Within moments, the 21 men who had entered the palace as proud warriors were transformed into swine, grunting and snorting as they rooted about the hall in confusion. Circe laughed, but it was not a cruel sound. Rather, it held the satisfaction of an artist completing a masterwork. "There," she said, speaking to the transformed men as if they could understand. "Now your outer forms match your inner natures. Men are such greedy, base creatures, always thinking with their bellies and their lusts. As pigs, you will be happier, I think." She herded the swine out to pens behind the palace, where they joined other animals that had once been men, sailors from ships that had found their way to Aea over the years, all transformed by the sorceress's magic into forms she deemed more suitable to their characters. Eurylochus fled back to the ship, his heart pounding with terror and grief. When he reached Odysseus and told him what had befallen their companions, the king felt his blood turn cold. Here was magic beyond anything they had faced, an enemy who could rob men, not just of their lives, but of their very humanity. But Odysseus wasn't one to abandon his men, no matter what form they now wore. Taking up his sword and spear, he set out alone toward Circe's palace, ignoring Eurylochus's pleas that he not throw his life away in a hopeless rescue attempt. As he made his way through the flower-scented groves, a young man appeared on the path before him. The stranger was handsome beyond mortal measure, with golden hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the ages. In his hand he carried a staff twined with serpents, and at his feet were winged sandals that barely touched the ground. "Odysseus," the youth said, and his voice carried the authority of divinity. "I am Hermes, messenger of the gods, and I have come to aid you. You go to face Circe, the sorceress, but without my help, you will share the fate of your companions. She will offer you wine mixed with her magical herbs, and once you drink, you too will become a beast in her pens." The god reached down and plucked a small plant from the earth, a white flower with a black root that seemed to pulse with its own life. "This is mole," Hermes explained, "a herb that grows only in the gardens of the gods. Eat its root before you enter Circe's hall, and her magic will have no power over you. When she strikes you with her wand, draw your sword and threaten her life. She will recognize your immunity and offer to make you her lover. Accept, but first make her swear by the gods that she means you no harm." With these words, Hermes vanished like morning mist, leaving only the magical herb in Odysseus's hand. The king ate the bitter root, feeling its power spread through his body like fire, then continued toward the palace with new confidence. Circe received him as she had the others, with seeming joy and elaborate hospitality. She led him to the same hall where his companions had been transformed, and offered him the same wine that had been their downfall. But when Odysseus drank, the moly in his system turned the magical brew harmless, and he felt no change except a slight dizziness from the ordinary wine that had been its base. When Circe raised her golden wand and spoke the words of transformation, nothing happened. The sorceress stepped back in amazement, her eyes wide with shock. In all her centuries of practicing magic, no mortal had ever resisted her spells. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe and sudden fear. "What man could drink my wine and remain unchanged?" Instead of answering, Odysseus drew his sword and sprang forward, pressing its point to her throat. "I am Odysseus of Ithaca," he said, his voice deadly calm, "and I have come for my men. Transform them back to their true forms, or by the gods, I will end your life here and now." Circe's fear melted into admiration, and her eyes began to sparkle with new interest. "Odysseus," she breathed, "I have heard of you. The sacker of cities, the man of many wiles. Only you could have resisted my magic. Indeed, Hermes once prophesied that a hero would come to my island, one who could not be changed by my arts." She set aside her wand and knelt before him, her hands clasped in supplication. "Great king," she said, "put away your sword. I mean you no harm. Indeed, I would have you stay as my honored guest to share my table and my bed. What say you to remaining here with me, where you could know pleasures beyond mortal imagining?" But Odysseus kept his sword at her throat. "Beautiful Circe," he replied, "how can you ask me to be gentle with you when you have transformed my men into swine? And how can I trust your offer when your nature is to deceive? If you would have me as a guest rather than a victim, swear to me by the blessed gods that you will work no evil magic upon me." Circe nodded solemnly and spoke the binding oath that no god or goddess could break without facing the wrath of Zeus himself. Only then did Odysseus lower his weapon and accept her offer of hospitality. The goddess proved true to her word. She led him out to the pens where the transformed men rooted in the mud, and with words of power and gestures of grace, she reversed her magic. The swine began to change, their forms flowing like water until they stood again as men. But men improved by the transformation. They were taller than before, more handsome, and in the prime of their strength. The joy of reunion was beyond description. The men wept to see their king again, and Odysseus felt his heart swell with relief at having them restored. Even Eurylochus, when he was finally convinced to come to the palace, marveled at the change in their fortune. Circe proved to be a hostess beyond compare once her magical nature was bound by sacred oaths. She provided them with baths in silver tubs filled with warm, scented water, and gave them fresh clothing woven from threads finer than any mortal loom could produce. The feast she prepared surpassed any they had known, with delicacies that seemed to nourish not just their bodies, but their very souls. As the days passed, Odysseus found himself drawn to the goddess in ways he had not expected. She was not merely beautiful, but wise beyond mortal understanding, versed in lore that stretched back to the dawn of time. In the evenings, they would sit together in her garden while she told him stories of the gods and the secret workings of the world. But Circe was more than a keeper of ancient wisdom. She was a companion who understood the loneliness of exceptional beings. Like Odysseus, she was set apart from others by her nature and abilities. In their conversations, she revealed depths of feeling and thought that made her seem less like a goddess and more like a kindred spirit. Days flowed into weeks, and weeks into months, as Odysseus and his men remained on Aia. The sorceress used her magic to provide for all their needs, and the island itself seemed to exist outside the normal flow of time. It was a place of eternal summer, where no want was felt, and no sorrow could find root. For Odysseus's men, this was paradise. They had fine food, comfortable beds, and no dangers to face. The memory of Troy's horrors faded like a bad dream, and even their longing for home grew dim in the peaceful atmosphere of the enchanted island. But for their king, contentment proved more elusive. Even in the midst of pleasure and luxury, the image of Penelope would come to him, her face as he had last seen it, trying to be brave as he sailed away to war. He would remember Telemachus as a baby, taking his first uncertain steps, and wonder what manner of man his son had become in his absence. A full year passed on Circe's island before Odysseus's men finally approached him with their concerns. Led by Eurylochus, they came to him as he sat in the goddess's garden, watching the sun set over the wine-dark sea. "My lord," Eurylochus said, his voice respectful but firm, "we have been thinking of home. It has been a year since we arrived on this blessed island, and though we lack nothing here, we are still men of Ithaca. Our families wait for us, and our king, though she cannot know it. Penelope waits for you." The words struck Odysseus like arrows, awakening the longing he had tried to suppress. He looked around at the perfect beauty of Circe's realm, then at his men's faces, and saw reflected there his own hidden desire to continue their journey. That night he approached Circe as she sat weaving at her golden loom, creating tapestries that told the stories of gods and heroes. Her fingers moved like music among the threads, and the images that emerged seemed to live and breathe in the shifting light. "Beloved goddess," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "you have been kinder to us than we deserved, and your island has been a refuge when we needed it most. But I must ask you to fulfill the promise you made when first we came to your hall, to send us safely on our way." Circe's hands stilled on her loom, and for a moment sorrow passed across her divine features, like a cloud across the sun. But when she spoke, her voice held only understanding and love. "Noble Odysseus," she said, "I have known from the beginning that this day would come. Your heart belongs to another, and your fate lies not in my timeless realm, but in the mortal world of struggle and change. I will not keep you here against your will, though it grieves me to see you go." She rose from her loom and moved to stand beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "But know this, my dear king, the path ahead will test you as nothing yet has done. Before you can reach your beloved Ithaca, you must journey to the very edge of the world, to the realm where the living may speak with the dead." Odysseus felt a chill run through him at her words. "What do you mean, goddess? What journey could be more perilous than those we have already undertaken?" Circe's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing visions of things yet to come. "You must sail to the river Acheron, where it flows into the underworld. There you must speak with the spirit of the prophet Tiresias, who alone can tell you how to appease Poseidon's anger and find your way home. Without his guidance, you will wander the seas until death takes you." The next morning, Circe provided them with provisions for their journey and a black ram and ewe for the sacrifices they would need to make. As they prepared to depart, she took Odysseus aside and gave him detailed instructions for the ritual that would allow him to speak with the dead. "When you reach the place where the rivers of the underworld meet," she said, "dig a pit with your sword and pour into it the blood of the sacrificed animals. The spirits of the dead will be drawn to the blood like moths to flame. But you must not let any drink until Tiresias has spoken. Guard the pit with your sword, and the prophet will come to you." Their farewell was both tender and sorrowful. Circe had been more than a hostess. She had been a friend and companion during some of the most peaceful months of Odysseus's long journey. As their ship pulled away from Aiaia's shore, she stood watching from her palace steps, a figure of divine beauty, growing smaller and smaller until she was lost in the morning mist. The journey to the edge of the world took them through waters that grew progressively stranger and more forbidding. The sky darkened from blue to grey to the color of old iron, and the sun seemed to lose its warmth as they sailed north and west. The sea itself became different, quieter, more ominous, as if they were approaching the very boundaries of the living world. On the final day of their voyage, they came to a shore unlike any they had ever seen. The beach was made of black sand that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and beyond it stretched a landscape of shadows and mist. No birds sang here, no wind stirred the air. This was the place where the river Acheron flowed from the world above into the realm of Hades below. Following Circe's instructions, Odysseus and his men found the meeting place of the rivers, a spot where dark waters swirled together in patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. Here, with hands that trembled despite his courage, Odysseus dug a pit with his sword and prepared for the most terrible ritual of his life. The sacrifice was performed with all the solemnity the occasion demanded. As the blood of the black ram and ewe flowed into the pit, the very air seemed to thicken and change. Shadows began to move independently of the objects that cast them, and from the mist came sounds, whispers, moans, the rustle of invisible garments. Then there came the spirits of the dead, drawn by the scent of blood and the promise of momentary strength. They approached the pit like figures seen in dreams, translucent and wavering, their faces bearing the marks of how they had died. Warriors bore the wounds that had slain them, and those who had died of sickness appeared pale and wasted. Among the first to approach was a spirit Odysseus recognized with a shock of grief, Elpenor, the youngest of his crew, who had fallen from Circe's roof while drunk with wine and broken his neck. The young man's ghost looked at his former captain with eyes full of reproach. "Lord Odysseus," the spirit said, his voice like wind through dry leaves, "you left me behind on Circe's island, unburied and unmourned. I beg you, when you return there, give my body the rites it deserves. Burn me with my armor, and raise a mound over my ashes, that future sailors might know that here lies one who died far from home." Odysseus's heart was heavy with remorse as he promised to honor his fallen comrade's request. But even as he spoke with Elpenor, other spirits pressed closer to the pit, their hunger for the blood that would give them temporary substance, almost overwhelming their reason. Then came a spirit that made Odysseus's knees weak with emotion, his own mother, Anticlea, who had died while he was fighting at Troy. She approached the pit with arms outstretched, her face bearing the same loving expression he remembered from childhood. But though every fiber of his being longed to embrace her, he kept his sword between her and the blood, knowing he must wait for Tiresias. At last the prophet came. Tiresias had been blind in life, but in death his inner sight was clearer than ever. He was an ancient spirit, bent with age, leaning on a golden staff that seemed to glow with its own light. When Odysseus stepped aside to let him drink, the prophet's form became more solid, more real. "Son of Laertes," Tiresias said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "you seek a path home, but the road will be long and hard. Poseidon's anger burns against you for the harm you did to his son Polyphemus, and the sea god will make your journey a trial of endurance." The prophet's blind eyes seemed to see visions of the future as he continued. "You will come to an island where the sacred cattle of the sun god graze. If you and your men leave these animals unharmed, you may yet reach home, though late and after many sufferings. But if you harm even one of Helios's cattle, your ship will be destroyed and your men will perish. You alone will survive, and you will reach home on a stranger's ship to find your house full of suitors, eating your substance and courting your wife." Odysseus felt despair wash over him at these words, but Tiresias was not finished. "When you reach Ithaca, you must not rest, for your trials will not be over. Take an oar from your ship and travel inland until you come to a people who know nothing of the sea, who mistake your oar for a winnowing fan. There, sacrifice to Poseidon, and the god's anger will finally be appeased." The prophet's form began to fade as the blood's power waned, but his final words carried clearly across the boundary between life and death. "Death will come to you in your old age, gentle as sleep, from the sea that has been both your enemy and your highway. Your people will prosper, and your name will be remembered as long as men tell stories around their fires." With Tiresias gone, Odysseus allowed other spirits to approach the pit. He spoke long with his mother, learning of the sorrows that had befallen his household in his absence. Anticlea told him of Penelope's faithfulness, of young Telemachus growing to manhood, and of his father Laertes' grief for his missing son. Other great spirits came to drink and speak: Agamemnon, who warned him of the treachery of women, and Achilles, who declared that he would rather be a slave among the living than a king among the dead. These conversations with the heroes of the past filled Odysseus with both sorrow and resolve, reminding him of the glory and tragedy that were the lot of mortal men. When at last the ritual was complete and the spirits faded back into the mist, Odysseus and his men returned to their ship with heavy hearts. The knowledge of what lay ahead was a burden, but it was also a gift, forewarning that might help them avoid the worst of the perils to come. The journey back to Circe's island seemed to take no time at all, as if the goddess had bent space and time to speed their return. They found Elpenor's body where it had fallen and gave it the burial rites his spirit had requested, raising a mound over his ashes and placing his oar upon it as a monument. Circe received them with joy, amazed that living men had journeyed to the realm of the dead and returned. When Odysseus told her of Tiresias's prophecy, she nodded solemnly, for she had seen glimpses of his fate in her own divinations. "The prophet has spoken truly," she said, "but his words were not complete. Let me tell you of the perils you will face before you reach the island of the sun god's cattle." That night, as they feasted together one last time, Circe spoke of the trials that awaited them. Her voice was soft and musical, but her words painted pictures of danger and wonder that would have seemed impossible to believe had they not already lived through so many marvels. "First," she said, "you will come to the island of the Sirens, those daughters of song whose voices can charm the soul from a man's body. They sit in a meadow filled with the bones of those who have heard their music and forgot all else, forgot food, forgot water, forgot the very will to live. No man who hears their song can resist its power, for they sing to each listener of the thing he most desires to know." She paused to sip her wine, her eyes reflecting the firelight like captured stars. "If you would pass their island safely, you must stop the ears of your men with soft wax, so they cannot hear the deadly music. But if you yourself would hear their song, and I know your curious nature, clever Odysseus, have your men bind you to the mast and command them not to free you, no matter how you plead." The goddess continued her catalogue of horrors and wonders. "Beyond the Sirens' island, you will come to a strait where two monsters dwell. On one side lurks Scylla, who was once a beautiful nymph, but is now a horror with 6 heads, each mouth filled with 3 rows of teeth. She dwells in a cave high up on the cliff, and when ships pass below, she strikes like lightning, seizing 6 men in her jaws. On the other side of the narrow strait churns Charybdis, a whirlpool that 3 times a day sucks down the sea and 3 times spews it forth. If your ship is caught in her maw when she draws in the water, not even Poseidon could save you." Better to lose 6 men to Scylla than your entire crew to Charybdis." As the night deepened, Circe's warnings grew more urgent. "But the greatest test will come when you reach Thrinacia, the island where Helios pastures his sacred cattle. These are no ordinary beasts. They are immortal, children of the sun itself, and their death would diminish the light of the world. If your men are starving, if the winds keep you on that island for days or weeks, they will be tempted to take the cattle for food. You must prevent this at all costs, for the sun god's vengeance is swift and terrible." When morning came, the parting was gentler than before, for both Odysseus and Circe knew this farewell was final. She had given him all the wisdom she could, and his path now led away from her timeless realm into the mortal world of consequence and change. As their ship sailed from Aiaia for the last time, Circe stood on her palace steps, raising her arms in blessing. The wind that filled their sail was her gift, and it carried them swiftly toward their destiny. The first sign that they were approaching the Sirens' island was the perfect stillness of the sea. The wind that had driven them forward suddenly died, leaving their sail hanging limp. The water became like glass, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it seemed they sailed through air between 2 heavens. Remembering Circe's warnings, Odysseus took the soft wax she had given him and warmed it in his hands until it was pliable. Moving among his men, he carefully sealed each man's ears, pressing the wax deep enough to block all sound. To them, the world suddenly became silent as a tomb, and they could communicate only through gestures. Then, with hands that showed no tremor despite his racing heart, Odysseus took the ropes his men offered and allowed himself to be bound tightly to the mast. The bonds were secure, but not cruel, tight enough that he could not break free, but comfortable enough that he could stand the strain for hours if necessary. As they rowed toward the island, for without wind the oars were their only means of propulsion, Odysseus saw the place of the Sirens' dwelling. It was an island of surprising beauty, with green meadows that rolled down to white beaches. But as they drew closer, the true nature of the place became apparent. The meadows were not filled with flowers, but with bones, the skeletal remains of sailors who had heard the Sirens' song and wasted away while listening, forgetting to eat or drink in their enchantment. Then the music began. It started as a whisper, so faint that Odysseus almost thought he had imagined it. But the sound grew stronger, resolving into voices of such beauty that they seemed to come not from mortal throats, but from the very harmony of the spheres. The Sirens themselves were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps they sang from caves in the island's cliffs, or perhaps they were invisible, beings of pure song made manifest. But oh, what song it was! The voices wove together in melodies that seemed to contain all the music that had ever been or ever could be. And as Circe had warned, they sang to Odysseus of the very things he most longed to know. "Come, renowned Odysseus," they sang, "glory of the Greeks, bring your ship to our shore and hear our song. No man has ever sailed past our island without stopping to listen, for we know all things that were and are and shall be. We know of your struggles at Troy, of your clever mind that conceived the wooden horse. We know of your journey and your longing for home, and we can tell you secrets that will make you the wisest of mortal men." The temptation was almost overwhelming. The Sirens sang of knowledge beyond mortal understanding, of the hidden workings of fate and the secret purposes of the gods. They promised to reveal the answers to questions that had plagued philosophers since the dawn of time. All he had to do was tell his men to turn toward shore. Odysseus strained against his bonds, opening his mouth to shout commands to his crew. But the wax in their ears blocked his voice as surely as it blocked the Sirens' song. His men, seeing his struggles, only rowed harder, their faces set with determination to honor their captain's original orders. The song grew more urgent, more personally tailored to his desires. The Sirens spoke of Penelope, promising to tell him of her secret thoughts and dreams. They sang of Telemachus, offering to reveal what manner of man his son had become. They whispered of Ithaca, describing changes that had come to his kingdom in his absence. But even as the music threatened to drive him mad with longing, a part of Odysseus's mind remained clear enough to notice something the goddess had not mentioned. The Sirens' song, for all its beauty, carried an undertone of desperation. They needed listeners as much as listeners needed their music. Their power was not absolute. It required willing participation, and the bonds that held him to the mast were proof against their magic. The realization helped him endure the remaining time it took to pass the island. Gradually, the song faded behind them until it was only a whisper, then silence. When they were well clear of the Sirens' realm, Odysseus's men removed the wax from their ears and untied their captain from the mast. "What did they sing of, Lord?" asked Eurylochus, his curiosity evident despite the relief on his face. Odysseus was quiet for a long moment, still feeling the echo of that divine music in his soul. "They sang of knowledge," he said finally, "and of the terrible price of wisdom. But we have passed their test, and we are still ourselves." But their trials were far from over. Even as the Sirens' island faded behind them, new dangers appeared ahead. The sea began to narrow, squeezed between towering cliffs that rose like walls on either side. This was the strait where Scylla and Charybdis waited, and the very water seemed to sense their presence, growing choppy and unpredictable. On the left side of the strait, they could see Charybdis at work. 3 times each day, the monster drew in the sea like a great mouth drinking, creating a whirlpool that could swallow islands. The water spun in a spiral that seemed to descend to the very bottom of the world, and the sound it made was like the roar of 1,000 waterfalls. But even more terrifying was what they could not see. Scylla dwelt in a cave high up on the opposite cliff, hidden in shadows that seemed to move independently of the light. The monster had once been a lovely sea nymph, beloved by fishermen and sailors, but jealousy among the gods had transformed her into something horrible, beyond description. Odysseus knew from Circe's warnings that he faced an impossible choice. To steer close to Charybdis meant risking his entire ship and crew. To hug the opposite shore meant sailing within reach of Scylla's terrible heads. There was no path through the strait that did not demand a price in blood. He made his decision with the cold calculation of a general who knows that some battles cannot be won without loss. Better to lose 6 men to Scylla than to risk losing everyone to Charybdis. He ordered his helmsman to steer close to the cliff where the 6-headed monster waited. As they entered the narrowest part of the strait, the very air seemed to thicken with menace. The crew rowed in grim silence, their eyes fixed on the churning water ahead, trying not to look up at the shadows that moved in the cliff face above them. The attack, when it came, was swifter than thought. 6 serpentine necks, each longer than their ship's mast, struck down from the cave like lightning. In the time it takes to draw a breath, 6 of Odysseus's bravest companions were seized and lifted, screaming toward the monster's lair. The horror of that moment would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. The men who were taken called out to Odysseus by name, their voices growing fainter as they were carried upward to a fate too terrible to contemplate. But there was nothing their captain could do. To stop or turn back would have meant the destruction of the entire crew. "Row!" Odysseus commanded, his voice hoarse with grief and rage. "Row as you have never rowed before." The survivors bent to their oars with desperate strength, driving their ship through the remainder of the strait and out into open water beyond. Behind them, the sounds from Scylla's cave faded into merciful silence, but the memory of their lost companions would echo in their hearts forever. They had passed through the strait, but at a cost that left them all diminished. The crew that had followed Odysseus from Troy was growing smaller with each trial, and those who remained were marked by sorrows that aged them beyond their years. For several days they sailed through calmer waters, each man dealing with his grief in his own way. Some wept openly for the friends they had lost, while others grew silent and grim, their eyes holding the hollow look of those who have seen too much. Odysseus himself seemed to age years in those few days, the weight of command and responsibility pressing down on him like a mountain. But ahead lay their final test, the island of Thrinacia, where the sun god's sacred cattle grazed in eternal sunlight. As their ship approached the island's shores, Odysseus remembered Tiresias's warning and felt a chill of premonition that had nothing to do with the wind. The island was beautiful beyond description, with beaches of golden sand and hills covered in grass that seemed to glow with its own light. And everywhere they looked, cattle grazed peacefully. Magnificent beasts with hides that shimmered like burnished bronze, and eyes that held the warmth of sunlight itself. These were no ordinary animals. They were the immortal herds of Helios, children of the sun, and their presence gave the island an otherworldly quality. The very air seemed to hum with divine power, and the light that bathed everything was subtly different from normal daylight, purer, more golden, as if filtered through heavenly realms. Odysseus gathered his men on the beach and spoke to them with all the authority and urgency he could muster. "My friends," he said, "we have survived trials that would have broken lesser men, But our greatest test may lie here on this peaceful shore. These cattle belong to Helios, the sun god, and they are sacred beyond all other beasts. We must not harm them, no matter what temptation arises. Promise me this. Swear by all the gods that you will not touch these animals, no matter how great our hunger becomes." The men, still shaken by their losses in the strait, were quick to give their oaths. They had no desire to face divine wrath after coming so far, and the island seemed to offer enough other resources to sustain them. Fish swam in the clear waters around the shore, and fruit trees grew wild in the interior. Surely they could find enough food without molesting the sun god's herds. But the gods, it seemed, had one more trial in store for them. No sooner had they made camp on the beach than the wind began to blow. Not the gentle breeze that had carried them from Circe's island, but a fierce gale that made sailing impossible. Day after day, the wind howled from the north, driving waves against the shore with such force that launching their ship would have meant certain destruction. At first, the enforced stay seemed like a blessing. The island was beautiful, the weather was warm, and they had time to rest and recover from their recent ordeals. They fished in the island's bays, gathered fruit from its groves, and slowly began to heal from the wounds, both physical and spiritual, that their journey had inflicted. But as days stretched into weeks, their provisions began to run low. The fish grew scarce, as if driven away by some divine influence, and the fruit trees seemed to bear less with each passing day. The men grew thin and hollow-eyed, their strength ebbing like tide from a beach. Through it all, the sacred cattle grazed peacefully in their meadows, their flesh growing ever more tempting to the starving sailors. The beasts seemed to mock them with their abundance, their well-fed forms a constant reminder of the feast that lay tantalizingly out of reach. Odysseus did his best to keep his men's spirits up and their thoughts away from the forbidden herds. He led them in prayers to the gods for favorable winds, organized fishing expeditions to distant parts of the island, and even tried to build a raft that might carry them to safety. But the gale continued to blow, and their situation grew more desperate with each passing day. The crisis came when Odysseus, exhausted by worry and sleepless nights, finally succumbed to the rest his body craved. He had been keeping constant watch over his men, knowing that their desperation was growing beyond safe limits. But mortal flesh has its limits, and he fell into deep sleep on the beach, lulled by the sound of waves and wind. It was then that Eurylochus, his oldest friend and most trusted lieutenant, made the decision that would doom them all. Gathering the surviving crew around him, he spoke words that seemed reasonable to men driven to the edge of starvation. "My friends," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, "we are dying slowly here, wasting away while abundance surrounds us. What death is worse, to starve on this beach like dogs, or to face the anger of the gods like men? If we must die, let us at least die with full bellies, and let us honor the gods with proper sacrifice before we feast." The logic was seductive to men who had not eaten a proper meal in weeks. They told themselves that they would take only one beast, that they would offer the proper prayers and sacrifices, that surely the gods would understand their desperate need. The hunger that gnawed at their bellies made any rationalization seem reasonable. They chose the finest bull from the herd, a magnificent creature whose hoard gleamed like polished gold in the sunlight. With prayers and rituals, hollow though they were, they made their sacrifice to the gods, then prepared the meat for roasting. The smell of cooking beef filled the air, and for the first time in weeks, the men's faces showed something other than despair. But their crime did not go unnoticed. Even as they feasted, signs of divine displeasure began to manifest. The meat on their spits began to low like living cattle, and the hides they had stripped from the carcass crawled about the camp as if still animated by life. The very air grew thick with omens and portents, warning of the wrath to come. Odysseus awoke to find his worst fears realized. The smell of roasted meat filled his nostrils, and he knew without looking what his men had done. Rising from the beach where he had slept, he saw them gathered around their fires, their faces flushed with the first full meal they had enjoyed in weeks. "What have you done?" he cried, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "Have you forgotten your oaths? Have you forgotten the warnings of the prophet and the goddess?" But it was too late. The deed was done, and no amount of regret could undo it. Even as Odysseus spoke, a divine messenger was already speeding toward the halls of Olympus, carrying news of the sacrilege to Helios himself. The sun god's rage, when it came, shook the very foundations of the world. His voice thundered across the heavens as he demanded justice from Zeus, king of the gods. "Father Zeus," Helios cried, "these men have slaughtered my sacred cattle, the joy of my heart, when I climb the star-filled sky, and when I turn back from heaven to earth. If they do not pay the proper price for their crime, I will sink down to Hades and shine among the dead." Zeus, who loved order above all things, could not let such sacrilege go unpunished. The king of the gods spoke in tones that made thunder seem like whispers. "Helios, continue to shine among the gods and mortal men. As for these sailors, I will strike their ship with my lightning and shatter it to splinters on the wine-dark sea." The reprieve lasted only long enough for the wind to change. After weeks of howling gales that had kept them prisoner on the island, the air suddenly grew still, then began to blow from the south, the direction they needed to continue their journey home. Odysseus knew this was no blessing, but a trap, the gods' way of luring them out onto the open sea where divine justice could be administered without harming the sacred island. But what choice did they have? To remain on Thrinacia would mean slow death by starvation, for the sun god would never again allow them to find sustenance there. With heavy hearts, they launched their ship and sailed away from the island where their folly had sealed their doom. The men who had feasted on the sacred cattle were already showing signs of the curse. Their faces had grown pale, and their movements sluggish, as if the life was slowly draining from their bodies. They had not been sailing for an hour when the storm struck, but this was no natural tempest. It was the wrath of Zeus himself made manifest. The sky turned black as night, and lightning split the heavens with bolts that seemed to tear holes in the very fabric of reality. The thunder that followed was so loud it seemed to shake the bones in their bodies. Then came the lightning bolt meant for them, a spear of pure divine fury that struck their ship's mast and ran down through the hull like liquid fire. The vessel split apart as if it were made of kindling, and the sea rushed in to claim what remained. In the chaos that followed, Odysseus saw his men, these brave souls who had followed him faithfully through 10 years of war and years of wandering, disappear beneath the waves. Some cried out his name as they sank, while others simply vanished without a sound. The sacred cattle had claimed their price, and the bill was paid in full. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage as the storm raged around him. By some miracle or curse, the gods had chosen to spare him alone, perhaps because he had not participated in the slaughter of the sacred beasts, or perhaps because his fate was not yet complete. For 9 days he drifted on the wine-dark sea, carried by currents that seemed to have a will of their own. The sun beat down on him mercilessly during the day, while the cold stars offered no comfort at night. He had no food, no fresh water, nothing but the makeshift raft he had constructed from the remains of his ship. On the 10th day, half dead from thirst and exposure, he washed ashore on an island that seemed to exist in a realm apart from the mortal world. This was Ogygia, home of the nymph Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas. The island was a paradise of sorts, with springs of clear water, groves of fruit trees, and meadows where flowers bloomed in eternal spring. Calypso herself was a being of extraordinary beauty, tall and graceful, with hair that caught light like spun gold, and eyes that held the depth of ocean waters. She found Odysseus collapsed on her beach, more dead than alive, and took pity on the broken hero. With gentle hands she carried him to her cave, which was furnished with all the comforts a goddess could desire. She nursed him back to health with ambrosia and nectar, the food and drink of the gods, and slowly the strength returned to his body. But the healing of his spirit would take much longer. The loss of his men, every single one of his loyal companions, had broken something fundamental in Odysseus's heart. These were men who had trusted him, who had followed him from Troy with faith that his wisdom would see them safely home. Now they lay beneath the sea, victims of a choice he had been powerless to prevent. Calypso did her best to comfort him, and indeed, life on her island was pleasant beyond mortal imagining. The nymph was not only beautiful, but intelligent and kind, a companion who could match his wit and understand his thoughts. She loved him deeply, in the way that immortal beings love, with a passion that burned like stars and promised to endure for all eternity. As the months passed, then years, Calypso offered Odysseus the greatest gift in her power, immortality itself. If he would stay with her as her beloved, she would make him a god like herself, free from the pain of mortality, the decay of age, and the inevitability of death. Why do you long for that rocky island called Ithaca? she would ask him as they walked along her perfect beaches. Why do you yearn for a mortal woman who grows older each day, when you could have eternal youth beside a goddess who will love you forever? The offer was tempting in ways that Calypso could not fully understand. Odysseus was tired of struggle, tired of loss, tired of the endless uncertainty that was the lot of mortal men. On Ogygia he could rest, could find peace, could leave behind the burdens that had weighed on him for so many years. But even as he lived in paradise, his heart remained fixed on a distant shore, where olive trees grew silver in the Mediterranean sun. Every morning he would climb to the highest point on the island and look out over the wine-dark sea toward the horizon, where Ithaca lay beyond his sight. And every evening he would return to Calypso's cave with salt tears on his cheeks, mourning not just for his lost men, but for the life that waited for him in the world of mortals. 7 years passed in this way. 7 years of comfort and sorrow, of divine love and human longing, of immortal beauty and mortal heartache. Calypso's devotion never wavered, but neither did Odysseus's desire to complete his journey home. It was Athena, goddess of wisdom and Odysseus's divine protector, who finally intervened. She had watched her favorite heroes suffering with growing concern, and she knew that his fate lay not in immortal paradise, but in the mortal world, where struggle and triumph went hand in hand. Appearing before Zeus in the halls of Olympus, Athena made her plea for Odysseus's release. "Father," she said, "surely this noble hero has suffered enough. He fought bravely at Troy, and his only crime since then has been the desire to return to his home and family. How long will you keep him prisoner on that distant island?" Zeus, moved by his daughter's words and perhaps weary of Poseidon's long-held grudge, agreed that the time had come for Odysseus to complete his journey. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, to Ogygia with commands that Calypso could not refuse. The nymph received the divine decree with a heavy heart, for she had hoped to keep her beloved with her for all eternity. But the will of Zeus was not to be denied, and she knew that love sometimes meant letting go. She found Odysseus in his usual place, sitting on the rocks that overlooked the sea, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. When she told him of Zeus's command, she saw something she had not seen in years, hope kindling in his eyes, like a flame long thought dead. "I will help you build a raft," she said, her voice steady despite her sorrow. "I will provision it with all you need for the journey, and I will ask the winds to carry you safely toward your home." The construction of the raft took several days, during which Calypso showed Odysseus every kindness. She gave him tools of divine craftsmanship, wood that would not rot or break, and supplies that would sustain him through any hardship. Her final gift was a wind that would blow him steadily toward the mortal world. Their parting was tender and sad, for despite everything, they had grown to love each other during their 7 years together. Calypso had been more than a captor. She had been a friend, a lover, and a source of a comfort during the darkest period of his life. But they both knew that his heart belonged elsewhere, to a woman who had waited faithfully for 20 years, and to an island that represented not just home, but his very identity. As his raft pulled away from Ogygia's shore, Odysseus looked back once at the goddess who had loved him so well. She stood on her beach, beautiful and eternal, growing smaller and smaller until she was lost in the morning mist. He would never see her again, but he would remember her kindness for the rest of his days. For 18 days, the raft carried him across the wine-dark sea, guided by stars and favorable winds. Odysseus had almost begun to believe that his trials were finally over, that the gods had at last grown weary of tormenting him. On the horizon, he could see the mountains of Scheria, home of the Phaeacians, those blessed people who lived closer to the gods than any other mortal race. But Poseidon, returning from a feast among the distant Ethiopians, spotted the lone figure on the raft and felt his old anger kindle anew. The sea god's wrath had not cooled during the years Odysseus spent with Calypso. If anything, it had grown stronger, like wine aging in darkness. "So," Poseidon rumbled, his voice like breaking waves on stone, "the other gods think to help my enemy while I was away. Well, let him learn that the sea still remembers the wrong done to my son." The storm that followed was perhaps the most terrible yet, for it carried not just the fury of wind and wave, but the personal hatred of a god. The sea rose in mountains around the tiny raft, and lightning split the sky with bolts that turned night to day and back to night again. Odysseus's carefully constructed vessel was torn apart like a child's toy, leaving him clinging to a single plank in the midst of chaos. For 2 days and nights he battled the storm, his strength sustained only by the divine food he had eaten on Calypso's island. When exhaustion finally claimed him and he began to sink beneath the waves, salvation came from an unexpected source. Ino, a sea goddess who had once been mortal herself, took pity on the struggling hero. Rising from the depths like sea foam given form, she pressed into his hands a magical veil that would keep him afloat, no matter how fierce the storm. "Noble Odysseus," she said, her voice barely audible above the howling wind, "strip off your clothes that the waves may not drag you down, and swim for the Phaeacian shore. When you reach safety, cast this veil back into the sea, and do not look back." With the goddess's gift wrapped around his chest, Odysseus abandoned the last remnants of his raft and struck out for shore. The swim seemed to last forever. His muscles screamed with exhaustion, his lungs burned with salt water, and more than once the waves drove him so deep he thought he would never see daylight again. But gradually the sound of the storm began to fade behind him, and ahead he could hear something sweeter than any music, the sound of waves breaking gently on a sandy beach. With his last reserves of strength, he fought through the surf and crawled onto the shore of Scheria, more dead than alive. As soon as his feet touched dry land, he cast Ino's veil back into the sea as she had commanded, then collapsed among the dunes like a shipwrecked sailor from some ancient story. Sleep took him immediately, deep, dreamless sleep that was like a small death and rebirth combined. He awoke to the sound of laughter and voices, sweet as birdsong after the harsh roar of the storm. Opening his eyes, he saw a group of young women playing with a ball on the beach, their white garments fluttering in the morning breeze like the wings of seabirds. One of the maidens stood apart from the others, and even in his exhausted state, Odysseus could see that she was no ordinary girl. She was tall and graceful, with the bearing of one born to command, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of wisdom beyond her years. This was Nausicaa, daughter of King Alcinous of the Phaeacians. When the ball went astray and rolled near the place where Odysseus lay hidden, the princess approached to retrieve it. She started when she saw the stranger among the dunes, a man weathered by sun and sea, his skin darkened by years of wandering, his hair and beard bleached white by salt spray. But Nausicaa was no ordinary maiden. She had the courage of her royal blood and the kindness that was the hallmark of her people. Instead of fleeing in terror, she stood her ground as Odysseus rose slowly to his feet, holding a branch before him for modesty. "Princess," he said, his voice hoarse from salt water and disuse, "I beseech you by your knees, whether you are a goddess or a mortal woman. If you are a goddess, surely you are Artemis, for never have I seen such beauty joined with such nobility. If you are mortal, then blessed are your father and mother, blessed are your brothers, and most blessed of all will be the man who wins you as his bride." Nausicaa's cheeks colored at the stranger's courtly words, but she did not withdraw. "Sir," she replied, "you do not seem to be an evil man or a foolish one, though clearly you have suffered much. Zeus gives fortune and misfortune to men as he sees fit, and it is not for us to question his designs. But since you have come to our land, you shall not lack for clothing or anything else that is fitting for a suppliant to receive." She called to her companions, who had watched the encounter from a safe distance, and commanded them to bring food and clothing for the stranger. The Phaeacian girls, though frightened, obeyed their princess without question, for they knew her to be both wise and kind. While Odysseus bathed in a stream that ran down to the sea, washing away the salt and grime of his ordeal, Nausicaa's servants laid out fresh garments, a tunic and cloak of finest wool, soft as clouds and white as snow. When he emerged from his bath, Athena shed grace upon him, so that he appeared taller and more handsome, his hair curling like hyacinth flowers, his presence radiating the nobility of his birth. The transformation was so remarkable that even Nausicaa gasped in wonder. "Surely," she murmured to her companions, "this is no common sailor cast up by the waves. This man has the bearing of a king." After he had eaten the food they offered, bread and honey, olives and sweet wine, Nausicaa gave him directions to her father's palace and wise counsel for approaching the king and queen. "When you enter the great hall," she said, "pay no heed to my father, though he is a good and kindly king. Instead, go straight to my mother, Queen Arete, and clasp her knees in supplication. She is the wisest of women, and if she looks favorably upon you, you will surely find the help you seek." The journey to the palace led through the most beautiful city Odysseus had ever seen. The streets of the Phaeacian capital were paved with stones that seemed to glow with inner light, and the houses were built of materials that appeared to shift and change like mother of pearl. Gardens bloomed everywhere, filled with flowers that never faded, and fruit trees that bore in all seasons. But most wonderful of all was the harbour, where ships lay at anchor that needed no oars or sails. These were the magical vessels of the Phaeacians, ships that could read their captain's thoughts and sail to any destination across the world's vast waters. It was said that no Phaeacian ship had ever been lost, for they were guided by the gods themselves. The palace of King Alcinous surpassed even these wonders. Its walls were built of bronze that never tarnished, topped with a cornice of blue enamel that caught and reflected the light of sun and stars. The doors were of gold and silver, and they were guarded by dogs of the same precious metals, crafted by Hephaestus himself to be immortal sentinels. Inside, the halls were even more magnificent. Tapestries covered the walls, depicting the deeds of heroes and the stories of gods, and they seemed to move and change as the light shifted. Golden torches burned without being consumed, providing illumination that was warm and constant as sunlight. In the great hall, Odysseus found the Phaeacian nobles at their evening feast. King Alcinous sat on his throne of carved ivory, while beside him Queen Arete held court, spinning purple thread on a golden distaff. The sight of her reminded Odysseus painfully of Penelope, for there was something in the queen's bearing that spoke of wisdom and faithfulness. Following Nausicaa's advice, Odysseus walked directly to the queen and knelt before her, clasping her knees in the ancient gesture of supplication. As he did so, a hush fell over the entire hall, for the Phaeacians had never seen a stranger appear so suddenly in their midst. "Queen Arete," Odysseus said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall, "daughter of divine Rhexenor, I come to you in my extremity, and to your husband, and these noble guests. May the gods grant you all happiness in life, and may you leave your children to inherit your wealth and honors. But I beg you, send me to my native land with all speed, for I have suffered long, far from my friends." With these words, he sat down in the ashes beside the hearth, as was the custom for suppliants seeking protection. For a long moment, silence reigned in the hall as the Phaeacians looked upon this mysterious stranger who had appeared among them, like something from a dream. Then old Echeneus, wisest of the Phaeacian elders, spoke up. "Alcinous," he said, "it is not seemly that a guest should sit in the ashes of our hearth. Come, raise him up and seat him on a silver chair, and let the heralds mix wine for all, that we may pour libations to Zeus, protector of suppliants." King Alcinous himself rose and took Odysseus by the hand, leading him to a chair of honor beside the royal throne. Food and wine were brought, and the proper rituals were observed, for the Phaeacians were a people who honored the ancient laws of hospitality above all things. But though they welcomed the stranger warmly, they did not press him with questions about his identity or his past. It was Queen Arete who first noticed something familiar about the clothing he wore. "Stranger," she said, her voice thoughtful, "those garments you wear, who made them? Did you not say you came to us from the sea?" Odysseus smiled, recognizing the wisdom in her question. "My lady," he replied, "I have indeed suffered much upon the wine-dark sea. Today I came ashore on your island after 20 days on a raft, and your daughter found me there. She gave me these clothes and showed me kindness beyond measure, though she conducted herself with all the modesty and wisdom befitting a princess." At these words, King Alcinous frowned slightly. "If my daughter found you on the beach," he said, "why did she not bring you directly to our palace? That would have been the proper thing to do." "My lord," Odysseus replied carefully, "do not blame your daughter for any fault. She did indeed suggest that I accompany her, but I was ashamed to do so, fearing that you might be displeased to see a strange man walking with your maiden daughter. We mortals are quick to take offense, and I would not have your people speak ill of their princess on my account." This courteous reply pleased the king greatly, for it showed both wisdom and consideration for his daughter's reputation. "Stranger," he said, "I am not a man given to foolish anger, and your thoughtfulness does you credit. Indeed, I wish that a man such as yourself might remain here as my daughter's husband, if such were your desire. I would gladly give you a house and possessions if you would stay among us. But if your heart is set on leaving, no Phaeacian will detain you against your will. Tomorrow I will order a ship prepared to carry you wherever you wish to go." The offer was generous beyond measure, for the Phaeacians were known throughout the world for their wealth and their kindness to strangers. To marry a Phaeacian princess would mean a life of ease and comfort, surrounded by people who valued peace and beauty above all things. But Odysseus's heart was fixed on another destination. "Noble king," he said, "if you would indeed send me home, that would be the greatest gift you could give me. My heart longs for my native land, as a bird longs for its nest." The evening passed in pleasant conversation, with the Phaeacians sharing stories of their island and their customs. They spoke of their famous ships that could cross the world's waters in a single day, of their gardens that bloomed in eternal spring, and of their peaceful kingdom where war was unknown. As the night grew late, Queen Arete ordered servants to prepare a bed for their guest, with purple blankets and soft fleeces to keep him warm. It had been months since Odysseus had slept in a proper bed, and years since he had rested under a roof where he felt truly safe. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with winds that promised fair weather for sailing. King Alcinous kept his word, ordering his finest ship to be prepared for their guest's journey. But first he invited the stranger to attend the games that the young Phaeacian men held each day, to display their skill in running, wrestling, and other contests. The games were held in a field near the palace, and all the noble youth of the island came to compete. Odysseus watched with interest as they ran races swift as the wind and wrestled with grace that made their contests look like dances. Their skill was remarkable, though it was clear that these were men who had never known the harsh training of war. When the competitions were finished, Prince Laodamas, Alcinous' son, approached the stranger with a friendly smile. "Come, guest," he said, "will you not try your skill at some contest? Surely a man of your build knows something of athletic sports." But Odysseus declined politely, saying that his heart was too heavy with his troubles to take pleasure in games. This refusal stirred the pride of young Euryalus, one of the prince's companions, who spoke words that cut like a blade. "Indeed, stranger," Euryalus said with a mocking smile, "I would not have taken you for an athlete. You look more like a merchant captain, thinking only of cargo and profit. Sport is for better men than that." The insult hit its mark, for it questioned not just Odysseus's ability, but his nobility and honor. The hero's eyes flashed with anger as he rose to his feet, and those who watched saw something of the warrior that still lived within the travel-worn wanderer. "Young man," Odysseus said, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to command, "that was neither well said nor well thought. The gods do not give all gifts to all men. Some have beauty, others wisdom, and others skill in speech or sports. You yourself are fair to look upon, but your words reveal the poverty of your mind." Without another word, he strode to where the discuses lay, and chose the largest, a massive stone that was heavier than any the Phaeacians used in their competitions. With barely an effort, he hurled it far beyond the marks left by all the other throwers, the stone singing through the air like a bird in flight. The throw was so magnificent that even Athena, appearing in the guise of a spectator, called out in admiration. "No Phaeacian could match that cast," she cried, "not even in their dreams." Odysseus turned to face the stunned young men, his bearing now unmistakably that of a hero. "There is my mark, young men," he said calmly. "Let anyone match it if they can. And if any of you desire to test me in boxing or wrestling, or even running, let them come forward. You have stirred my anger, and I will compete with anyone save only Laodamas, for he is my host's son, and only a madman fights with those who show him kindness." The challenge hung in the air like thunder, but no one came forward to accept it. The Phaeacians had seen enough to know that this stranger was no ordinary man, and wise Alcinous quickly moved to restore harmony to the gathering. "Friend," the king said, "no one here questions your skill or your nobility. Come, let us turn to other pleasures. Let our bards sing for us, and our dancers show their art, that you may tell your own people that the Phaeacians excel in singing and dancing, as we do in seamanship and running." The entertainment that followed was like nothing Odysseus had ever witnessed. The Phaeacian bards sang with voices that seemed touched by divine inspiration, while their dancers moved with such grace that they appeared to float above the ground. The music was haunting and beautiful, speaking of loves and losses, of heroes and adventures, of the eternal themes that move the hearts of men. But it was when the blind bard Demodocus began to sing of the Trojan War that Odysseus felt his composure begin to crack. The poet sang of the quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles, of the wooden horse and the fall of Troy, of deeds that the wandering king had lived through, but now seemed as distant as legends. As the familiar story unfolded, Odysseus pulled his purple cloak over his head and wept, his shoulders shaking with sobs he could not suppress. The memories were too vivid, too painful. His lost comrades, the war's terrible cost, the years of wandering that had followed. Only King Alcinous noticed his guest's distress, for the king had been watching the stranger carefully throughout the day. With the courtesy that marked all his actions, Alcinous called for the song to end and the gathering to disperse. "Noble guest," he said when they were alone, "I see that our songs bring you pain rather than pleasure. Will you not tell us who you are and what sorrows weigh upon your heart? A trouble shared is a trouble lessened, and we are your friends here." The moment had come when concealment was no longer possible or necessary. Standing before the assembled Phaeacian nobles in their great hall, with wine cups glinting in the torchlight and faces turned toward him in expectant silence, Odysseus revealed his identity at last. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years and the authority of kingship. "I am he whom men call the sacker of cities, and my fame reaches to the very heavens. My home is Ithaca, a rugged island that breeds strong men. And though there are lands more beautiful and fertile, no sight is sweeter to me than my native shore." A murmur ran through the hall at this revelation, for the name of Odysseus was known to all the world. Here was the hero of the wooden horse, the man whose cunning had ended the 10-year siege of Troy. Here was the wanderer, whose story had become legend even while he still lived. "You ask me to tell of my sorrows," Odysseus continued, "and indeed the tale is long and full of wonders and woes. Where shall I begin? With the Lotus-Eaters who would have stolen our memories of home, with the Cyclops Polyphemus, whose eye I put out in his cave, with the sorceress Circe, who turned my men to swine, or with the Sirens, whose song could charm the soul from a man's body." Through the long night, Odysseus told his story, beginning with their departure from Troy and ending with his arrival on the Phaeacian shore. He spoke of gods and monsters, of magic and miracles, of the loss of his ships and men, and of the 7 years he had spent as Calypso's unwilling guest. The Phaeacians listened in rapt silence, their eyes wide with wonder at the tale of adventures beyond their peaceful experience. They gasped at the horrors he had faced, marveled at the wonders he had seen, and wept for the comrades he had lost. When dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and the tale was finally told, King Alcinous rose from his throne with tears in his eyes. "Noble Odysseus," he said, "you have suffered more than any man should have to bear. But your trials are at an end. Today we will send you home to Ithaca with such gifts as befit a hero of your stature." The preparations for his departure took the entire day, as the Phaeacians loaded their swiftest ship with treasures beyond counting. There were tripods and cauldrons of gold, chests filled with fine clothing, and weapons of divine craftsmanship. The gifts they gave him were worth more than the ransom of a dozen kings. As evening approached and the ship lay ready at the harbor, Queen Areta came to bid him farewell. In her hands she carried a chest of polished wood filled with the finest garments her own hands had woven. "Take these as a remembrance of me," she said, "and when you see your wife again, remember the Phaeacian queen who wished you well." Then, with the wisdom that had made her famous, she added, "May you find your home as you left it, and may the gods grant you happiness in your remaining years." The ship that carried Odysseus toward Ithaca was like no vessel ever built by mortal hands. It moved through the water as smoothly as a bird flies through air, guided by divine power and steered by the thoughts of its captain. The Phaeacian sailors needed no maps or stars to find their way. They simply thought of their destination, and their ship responded like a living thing. Odysseus slept during the voyage, a sleep so deep and peaceful that it was like a blessed oblivion. For the first time in 20 years, he rested without worry or care, knowing that he was in the hands of friends who would see him safely home. When morning came, the ship had reached the familiar waters around Ithaca. The Phaeacian sailors, following their king's instructions, carried the sleeping hero to a quiet cove and laid him gently on the sand beside a sacred olive tree. They placed his treasures around him and departed as silently as they had come, their ship disappearing into the morning mist like something from a dream. Odysseus awoke to the sound of waves lapping against a shore that seemed strangely familiar, yet somehow changed. At first, he did not recognize the place where he lay, for Athena had shrouded the island in mist to protect him from discovery. To his eyes, Ithaca appeared as a foreign land, and his heart filled with despair at the thought that the Phaeacians had deceived him. But soon the mist cleared, and he saw the landmarks of his youth, the harbor where he had learned to sail, the olive groves where he had played as a child, the hills where he had hunted deer and wild boar. After 20 long years of wandering, Odysseus had come home at last. His joy was so great that he fell to his knees and kissed the earth of his native land, weeping tears of happiness and relief. The soil of Ithaca had never seemed so precious, the air so sweet, the sunlight so warm and welcoming. But even as he celebrated his homecoming, Athena appeared before him in the guise of a young shepherd. The goddess had come to warn him of the dangers that awaited in his own palace and to help him plan his next moves carefully. "Stranger," she said, playing her role. "What land is this? I have traveled far and am lost." Odysseus, ever cautious, did not immediately reveal his identity. Instead, he spun a tale of being a fugitive from Crete, seeking refuge on this unknown shore. His caution amused the goddess, who smiled and revealed herself in her true form. "Clever Odysseus," she said, her eyes sparkling with affection. "Even in your own homeland, you weave stories and practice deception. It is this very cunning that has brought you safely through so many perils." She went on to tell him of the situation in his palace, painting a picture that filled him with rage and sorrow. For 3 years, she said, more than 100 suitors had been living in his house, eating his food, drinking his wine, and pressuring Penelope to choose one of them as her new husband. "They claim that you are dead," Athena explained, "and that it is time for your wife to remarry. They have consumed most of your wealth, corrupted your servants, and turned your own house into a den of revelry and waste. Worst of all, they plot to kill your son Telemachus, who has grown to manhood and begun to oppose them." The news struck Odysseus like a physical blow. His son, whom he had left as a baby, was now a man in danger of his life. His faithful wife was under siege in her own home. forced to endure the unwanted attentions of greedy men who sought to steal his throne. His carefully built kingdom was being devoured like a carcass by vultures. "What would you have me do, goddess?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. "First, we must disguise you," Athena replied, "so that you may enter your own house unknown and see the situation for yourself. Then, when the time is right, you will reveal yourself and reclaim what is yours." With divine power, she transformed his appearance completely. His weather-beaten skin became wrinkled and aged, his dark hair turned grey and sparse, and his proud bearing became the stoop of an elderly beggar. She dressed him in filthy rags and gave him a worn staff to lean upon. The transformation was so complete that even his closest friends would not recognize him. Only his eyes remained unchanged, still holding the sharp intelligence that had made him famous throughout the world. "Go now to the hut of Eumaeus, your faithful swineherd," Athena instructed. "He has remained loyal to your memory and will give you shelter. Meanwhile, I will fetch Telemachus from Sparta, where he has gone seeking news of you." The path to Eumaeus' hut led through groves and fields that stirred memories in every step. Here was the tree where he had carved his name as a boy. There the stream where he had learned to fish. Despite the changes that 20 years had brought, the essential character of his island remained the same. He found Eumaeus tending his pigs in a clearing surrounded by olive trees. The swineherd was a man of middle years, grey-bearded and weathered by outdoor work, but his eyes were kind and his manner honest. This was one of the few servants who had remained faithful to Odysseus's memory, refusing to be corrupted by the suitor's influence. When he saw the ragged stranger approaching, Eumaeus called out a greeting. "Come, old man," he said, "sit and rest yourself. I have bread and wine for any traveler who needs them, though these are hard times, and hospitality is not what it once was." Odysseus accepted the invitation gratefully, touched by the kindness shown to a seeming beggar. As they sat together sharing simple food, Eumaeus spoke of his master with love and loyalty that brought tears to the disguised king's eyes. "There was never a better man than my lord Odysseus," the swineherd said, his voice heavy with grief. 20 years he has been gone, and not a day passes that I do not pray for his return. But those cursed suitors in his house claim he is dead, and they waste his substance as if it were their own." The swineherd's loyalty was a balm to Odysseus's wounded heart, proof that not all of his kingdom had forgotten him. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening, with Eumaeus sharing news of the island and its people, while Odysseus carefully gathered information about his enemies. That night, as they prepared to sleep in the humble hut, Athena brought Telemachus from Sparta, where he had been visiting King Menelaus. The young man arrived at dawn, travel-stained and worried, for he had heard rumors that the suitors planned to ambush him on his return. When Telemachus entered the swineherd's hut, Odysseus felt his heart nearly stop with emotion. Here was his son, grown to full manhood in his absence, tall and strong, with the bearing of a prince and eyes that held both intelligence and courage. The resemblance to his father was unmistakable, though Telemachus had a gentleness that spoke of his mother's influence. Eumaeus embraced the young prince with joy, for he had raised the boy and loved him like his own son. "My dear child," he said, "I feared we would never see you again. The suitors have been spreading nets to catch you, and all the island has been in despair." Telemachus's eyes fell on the beggar sitting in the corner, and his natural courtesy prompted him to offer hospitality to the stranger. But when Eumaeus left the hut to tend his animals, Athena appeared to Odysseus and broke the spell of disguise. In moments, the aged beggar was transformed back into the hero of Troy, tall and powerful, his hair dark again, his rags replaced by fine clothing. Telemachus stepped back in amazement, thinking he was seeing a god. "Fear not," Odysseus said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I am no god, but your father, for whom you have grieved so long." The reunion between father and son was beyond description. 20 years of separation melted away as they embraced, both weeping with joy and sorrow combined. Telemachus had grown up with only stories of his father, while Odysseus had carried the image of a baby in his heart through all his wanderings. "My son," Odysseus whispered, holding the young man close. "Forgive me for leaving you so young, for missing your childhood, for not being there to guide and protect you. But I am here now, and we will face our enemies together." They spent the morning planning their strategy, father and son united at last in purpose. Telemachus told of the suitors' excesses, their insults to Penelope, their threats against his own life. Odysseus listened with growing anger, but also with pride in his son's courage and wisdom. "There are more than 100 of them," Telemachus warned, "and they are all armed and desperate. How can we hope to defeat so many?" "We have the gods on our side," Odysseus replied, "and justice fights with us. Besides, it is not the first time I have faced overwhelming odds. Trust in your father's experience and follow my lead." Their plan was simple, but dangerous. Odysseus would return to his disguise and enter the palace as a beggar, while Telemachus went openly as the returning prince. When the moment was right, they would retrieve the weapons Odysseus had hidden years before and confront the suitors. Before they parted, father and son spoke of Penelope, the woman who had held their family together through 20 years of absence and uncertainty. "Your mother," Odysseus said, his voice soft with love and admiration. "Has she remained faithful? Do the suitors press her hard?" "She is like a rock in a storm," Telemachus replied, unmoved by all their threats and promises. "Every day they demand that she choose a husband, and every day she finds new ways to delay. But I fear her strength is failing, and the people begin to murmur that she should remarry for the kingdom's sake." That afternoon, Odysseus resumed his beggar's disguise and made his way toward the palace, his heart heavy with anticipation and dread. The building that had been his pride and joy now showed signs of neglect and abuse. The walls needed repair, the gardens were overgrown, and the very air seemed thick with the stench of waste and corruption. As he approached the main courtyard, he encountered a sight that filled him with rage and pity. Lying on a dung heap near the gate was an ancient dog, so old and weak he could barely lift his head. But when the dog caught sight of the disguised king, his tail began to wag weakly, and his dim eyes brightened with recognition. This was Argos, the hunting hound Odysseus had trained as a puppy before leaving for Troy. The dog had waited 20 years for his master's return, and now, at the very moment of reunion, his strength finally gave out. Argos wagged his tail once more and died, having lived just long enough to see his beloved master come home. Odysseus knelt beside the faithful creature, tears streaming down his face as he gently closed the dog's eyes. In all his travels, through all his adventures and trials, no moment had touched him more deeply than this simple display of unwavering loyalty. The great hall of his palace was a scene of chaos and revelry that would have been unthinkable in Odysseus's day. More than 100 young men lounged on couches that had once been reserved for honored guests, eating from golden platters and drinking from silver cups. Servants hurried back and forth, some corrupted by the suitor's influence, others serving reluctantly out of fear. The suitors themselves were the flower of the nobility from Ithaca and the surrounding islands, handsome, well-educated young men who should have been the kingdom's pride. But power without responsibility had corrupted them, turning them into little more than parasites, feeding on the wealth of their absent king. At their head sat Antinous, the most arrogant and cruel of the lot, a man whose handsome face was spoiled by the sneer of perpetual contempt. Beside him lounged Eurymachus, smooth-tongued and false, who spoke honeyed words while plotting treachery. When the disguised Odysseus entered the hall, he was met with mockery and abuse. The suitors saw only a filthy beggar seeking scraps, and they amused themselves by hurling insults and even food at the stranger. "Look what the wind has blown in," Antinous sneered, picking up a footstool to throw. "Another worthless beggar come to disturb our feast. Get out, old man, before I have you beaten and thrown from the palace." But some of the suitors, those with more decency remaining, protested this treatment of a guest. "Leave the old man alone," said Amphinomus, one of the few among them who still showed traces of nobility. "It is not right to abuse strangers, for we know not what disguise the gods might wear." The words were more prophetic than Amphinomus knew, for indeed he sat in the presence of a hero beloved by Athena. But his kindness would not save him when the day of reckoning came, for he had chosen to cast his lot with evil men. As the afternoon wore on, Odysseus moved through the hall like a shadow, gathering information and studying his enemies. He learned which servants had remained loyal and which had been corrupted, which suitors were leaders and which were followers, where weapons were kept, and how the palace defenses had been arranged. But most importantly, he waited for a glimpse of Penelope, the wife whose faithfulness had sustained him through 20 years of wandering. She came at last, descending the great staircase that led from her chambers to the hall below. 20 years had passed since Odysseus had last seen her, and time had touched her as it touches all mortal things. Her hair, once dark as a raven's wing, now showed threads of silver, and her face bore the lines that sorrow carves upon the hearts of those who wait. But she was still beautiful, beautiful with the deeper beauty that comes from inner strength and nobility of spirit. She moved with the grace of a queen, her head held high despite the burdens she bore, her eyes still bright with the intelligence that had first captivated Odysseus in their youth. When she appeared, the rowdy suitors fell silent, awed despite themselves by her presence. Even in their corruption, they could recognize true nobility when they saw it, and Penelope possessed a dignity that no amount of suffering could diminish. "Noble suitors," she said, her voice clear and strong, "you claim to honor me with your courtship, yet you devour my husband's substance and show no respect for his house. If you would truly win my favor, bring your own gifts and hold your own feasts. Do not consume what belongs to another." Her words stung like arrows, for they laid bare the shameful nature of the suitors' behavior. Instead of wooing her with their own wealth and accomplishments, they had made themselves parasites in her home, eating food that rightfully belonged to her and her son. Eurymachus, ever quick with false words, rose to reply. "Wise Penelope," he said with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "we bring gifts willingly, for what man would not seek to win such a prize? But surely the time has come to choose among us. Your husband has been gone for 20 years. Is it not time to accept that he will never return?" "My heart knows what my heart knows," Penelope replied, with quiet dignity. "Until I have proof of my husband's death, I remain his wife. But I will not discuss this matter before strangers." Her eyes fell briefly on the disguised Odysseus, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of something. Recognition, curiosity, before she turned and left the hall. That evening, when the suitors had finally departed to their own homes, Penelope sent word that she would speak with the beggar privately. Odysseus's heart raced as he climbed the stairs to her chambers, wondering if somehow she had seen through his disguise. He found her in her sitting room, spinning by the light of golden lamps, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions, while her mind was clearly elsewhere. When she looked up at him, her eyes held a sadness so deep it seemed to encompass all the sorrows of the world. "Old stranger," she said gently, "sit and tell me your story. In these dark times, it comforts me to hear news of other lands, and perhaps you have word of my husband, who has been lost these many years." The conversation that followed was both sweet and bitter for Odysseus. Speaking in his beggar's voice, he told her tales of distant lands and famous men, weaving truth and fiction together with the skill that had made him famous. But when she asked directly about Odysseus, he found himself describing his own appearance and manner with aching accuracy. "I knew your husband well," he lied with a truth that cut his heart, "and never was there a more noble man. He had hair that curled like hyacinth flowers, and eyes that held both wisdom and kindness. His voice could command armies, or gentle frightened children, and his mind was the sharpest I have ever encountered." Penelope wept as she listened, her tears falling like rain on her embroidery. "Your words bring him back to me so clearly," she whispered, "that I almost believe he stands before me now. But dreams and wishes cannot change reality, and I fear I will never see him again." "Do not despair, noble queen," Odysseus said, his own voice thick with emotion. "I have heard from reliable sources that your husband lives and will return soon. Perhaps sooner than you think." She looked at him sharply, hope warring with disbelief in her eyes. "Many have told me such tales," she said, "and all have proved false. Why should I believe you when my heart has been broken so many times before?" "Because," he said carefully, "sometimes truth comes from the most unexpected sources. Keep faith a little longer, and you may be surprised by what the gods bring to pass." As the night deepened, Penelope called for her old nurse, Euryclea, to wash the stranger's feet, an act of hospitality that was customary for honored guests. The old woman had been Odysseus's nurse in childhood, and though she was now bent with age, her hands were still gentle, and her eyes still sharp. As she knelt to wash the beggar's feet, her fingers found a scar on his leg, a mark left by a boar's tusk during a hunting expedition in his youth. The moment her hand touched that familiar scar, Euryclea's eyes went wide with recognition. "My child!" she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "You are—" But Odysseus quickly placed his hand over her mouth, silencing her before she could speak his name. "Quiet, old mother," he breathed urgently. "If you love me, say nothing. The time is not yet right for my identity to be known." The old nurse nodded, tears of joy streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She had helped raise this man from infancy, had tended his wounds and celebrated his triumphs, and now he had returned to her like one risen from the dead. Penelope, busy with her spinning, had not noticed the exchange. But as the evening ended and she prepared to return to her chambers, she spoke words that showed the depth of her desperation. "Tomorrow," she said, her voice heavy with resignation, "I will announce a contest to the suitors. My husband's great bow hangs in the treasure room, and 12 axe heads are set up in the hall. Whichever man can string the bow and shoot an arrow through all 12 axe heads may claim me as his wife. It was a feat my husband accomplished easily, but I doubt any of these suitors can match his skill." Odysseus felt his heart leap at these words. The bow she spoke of was his own, a gift from the hero Iphitus, made from the horn of a wild ox, and stronger than any weapon forged by mortal hands. He had been the only man who could string it, and the contest would give him the perfect opportunity to reveal himself. "That is a wise test, my lady," he said carefully. "I believe your husband would approve of your choice, and who knows, perhaps the man who wins will prove worthy of your hand." The next morning dawned clear and bright, as if the gods themselves had ordained it for the contest that would decide the fate of Ithaca. The suitors gathered early in the great hall, their excitement palpable as they anticipated the end of their long courtship. Today, one of them would claim both Penelope and the throne of Ithaca. Penelope appeared in her finest robes, carrying the great bow in her own hands. The weapon was magnificent to behold. Its curves were perfect, its surface polished to a gleaming finish, and even unstrung, It radiated an aura of power that made strong men step back in respect. "Noble suitors," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "behold the bow of Odysseus and the test that will determine my future husband. 12 axe heads have been set in a line, and whosoever can string this bow and shoot an arrow through all 12 may claim my hand in marriage." The suitors pressed forward eagerly, each confident in his own strength and skill. Antinous was the first to try, his handsome face flushed with anticipation as he took the bow in his hands. But though he strained with all his might, pulling until his face turned red and sweat beaded on his forehead, he could not bend the weapon enough to attach the string. One by one, the other suitors tried and failed. Some could not even begin to bend the bow, while others managed to flex it slightly before their strength gave out. Eurymachus, who prided himself on his athletic prowess, struggled longer than most, but finally had to admit defeat, his hands bloody from the effort. As the failures mounted, the suitors began to grow angry and frustrated. This was not how they had expected the contest to end. Some suggested that the bow had been weakened by age, while others claimed it had been enchanted to prevent any man from stringing it. It was then that the disguised Odysseus stepped forward from his place near the wall. "Noble lords," he said in his beggar's voice, "might an old wanderer try his hand at this contest? I was once skilled with the bow, though my hands are not what they once were." The suggestion was met with derision and outrage from the suitors. Antinous, his pride stung by his failure, turned on the beggar with fury. "Insolent dog," he snarled. "Is it not enough that we suffer your presence in this hall? Now you would mock us by pretending you can accomplish what your betters cannot." But Telemachus, following the plan he and his father had made, spoke up in support of the stranger. "The beggar has as much right to try as anyone," he said firmly. "If he can string the bow, then he has earned that right. And if he fails, what harm is done?" Penelope, moved by some impulse she could not name, also spoke in favor of letting the stranger compete. "Let him try," she said quietly. "What harm can come of it?" With reluctance, the suitors stepped aside, grumbling among themselves, but not quite daring to refuse their hostess directly. Odysseus walked forward and took the bow in his hands, feeling the familiar weight and balance of the weapon that had been his companion in countless hunts. The moment his fingers touched the horn, he knew that it had been waiting for him all these years, as faithful as his dog Argos or his nurse Euryclea. The bow seemed to recognize its master, and when he began to bend it, the weapon yielded to his touch as if it were made of willow rather than ox horn. With movements as smooth as flowing water, Odysseus fitted the string to the bow's notch. The weapon sang as the string was drawn taut, a sound like wind through mountain peaks, like the call of eagles soaring high above the earth. The suitors watched in stunned silence as the ragged beggar knocked an arrow and drew the string back to his ear. His stance was perfect, his aim unwavering, and when he released the shaft, it flew straight and true through all 12 axe heads, striking the wall beyond with a sound like thunder. For a moment, the hall was silent as death. Then Odysseus straightened to his full height, and the disguise that Athena had placed upon him fell away like mist before the sun. His rags became gleaming armor, his bent back straightened, and his grey hair darkened to the black of his youth. "I am Odysseus," he declared, his voice ringing through the hall like a war trumpet. "I am the master of this house, the king of this island, and the husband of Penelope. For 20 years I have wandered, but now I have returned to reclaim what is mine." The transformation was so sudden, so complete, that for several heartbeats the suitors could not move or speak. They stared at the figure before them. No longer a beggar, but a hero of legend, terrible in his wrath and magnificent in his authority. Then Antinous, recovering from his shock, lunged for his sword. "Kill him!" he screamed, his voice cracking with fear and rage. "Dead or alive, he cannot be allowed to—" His words were cut short as Odysseus's second arrow took him in the throat, dropping him to the floor in a spreading pool of blood. The king's aim was as perfect as it had been 20 years before, and his anger was terrible to behold. "Dogs!" Odysseus roared, knocking another arrow. "You thought I would never return, that you could devour my substance and court my wife with impunity. But the gods have brought me home, and now you will pay the price for your crimes." What followed was less a battle than a slaughter, though the suitors fought with the desperation of men who knew they faced certain death. Telemachus appeared at his father's side, armed with spear and shield, while Eumaeus and Philoetius, the loyal cowherd, barred the doors to prevent escape. One by one, the suitors fell before Odysseus's arrows. He had hoarded his anger for 20 years, and now it poured out like a flood that sweeps away everything in its path. These men had insulted his wife, threatened his son, and squandered his wealth. Now they would face the consequences of their actions. Some tried to plead for mercy, claiming they had been led astray by others, or that they would make restitution for their crimes. But Odysseus's heart was hard as stone, for he knew that mercy to the guilty would be cruelty to the innocent. When his arrows were exhausted, he took up sword and spear, fighting with the skill that had made him famous in the war against Troy. Beside him, Telemachus proved himself his father's son, his blade flashing like lightning as he cut down those who had threatened his mother. The battle raged through the great hall, overturning tables and spattering the walls with blood. The beautiful tapestries that had adorned the room were torn and stained, and the golden cups that had held the suitors' wine now held only the silence of death. When it was over, when the last of the suitors had fallen, the hall looked like a field after a great battle. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, their fine clothes soaked with blood, their weapons scattered like broken toys. The proud young men who had thought themselves masters of Ithaca were now nothing more than carrion for the crows. But even in his triumph, Odysseus felt no joy, only the grim satisfaction of justice served. These had been his people's sons, the flower of the island's youth, and their deaths would leave many homes in mourning. But they had chosen their path, and he had simply walked with them to its end. The surviving servants were brought before the king for judgment. Those who had remained loyal were rewarded, while those who had betrayed their master's trust faced swift punishment. Odysseus was not a cruel man, but he was a king, and kingship sometimes demanded hard choices. Through all of this, Penelope remained in her chambers, for the women of the household had been sent away before the battle began. She had heard the sounds of fighting, the clash of weapons, and the cries of dying men. But she did not know what the outcome had been. It was Eurycleia who brought her the news, the old nurse's face shining with joy as she climbed the stairs to her mistress's room. "Wake up, dear child," she cried, unable to contain her excitement. "Wake up and see the day you have prayed for all these years. Odysseus has come home. He has killed the suitors and reclaimed his throne." But Penelope, who had endured 20 years of false hopes and broken promises, could not bring herself to believe such wonderful news. Too many times she had been told that her husband had returned, only to have her hopes crushed by reality. "Old nurse," she said sadly, "your mind has been touched by grief. My husband is dead, lost in some far land, and no power on earth can bring him back to me." "But I have seen him with my own eyes," Eurycleia protested. "I bathed his feet and felt the scar the boar gave him in his youth. It is truly Odysseus, returned at last." Still Penelope hesitated, her heart torn between hope and fear. If she believed and was wrong, the disappointment might kill her. If she doubted and was wrong, she would have insulted the husband she had waited for so long. Finally, she rose and followed the nurse down to the great hall, her steps slow and uncertain. What she saw there stopped her in her tracks, bodies everywhere, blood on the walls, and in the center of it all, a man who might or might not be her husband. He stood beside the great pillar that supported the roof, still armed and bloody from the battle, his eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her heart race. He was older than the young man who had sailed away to Troy, his hair touched with silver and his face marked by years of hardship. But there was something in his bearing, something in the way he looked at her, that stirred memories in her heart. "Penelope," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, warm and strong, with undertones that spoke of love deeper than the sea. But still she hesitated, for she had learned to be cautious in a world full of deception. "If you are truly my husband," she said carefully, "then prove it. Tell me something that only Odysseus would know." A smile touched his lips, the same smile that had won her heart 20 years before. "Shall I tell you of our bed?" he asked softly. "The bed I carved with my own hands from a living olive tree, whose roots still grow in the earth beneath our chamber floor." At these words, Penelope's defenses crumbled like walls before an earthquake. No one else knew the secret of their marriage bed, the symbol of their union that was rooted in the very earth of Ithaca. This was indeed her husband, returned to her at last. With a cry of joy, she ran to him, throwing her arms around his neck and covering his face with kisses. 20 years of separation vanished in an instant, as if they had never been apart. The king and queen of Ithaca were reunited at last, their love proven stronger than time, distance or the schemes of gods and men. "My dear husband," she whispered through her tears, "forgive me for doubting you. I had to be certain, for my heart could not bear to be broken again." "There is nothing to forgive," he replied, holding her close as if he would never let her go again. "Your caution was wisdom, and your faithfulness was the star that guided me home through all my wanderings." They stood together in the blood-stained hall, surrounded by the evidence of the price that had been paid for their reunion. But in that moment, nothing else mattered except that they were together again, husband and wife, king and queen, two souls who had found each other after 20 years of searching. The news of Odysseus's return spread through Ithaca like wildfire. Some rejoiced to see their rightful king restored to his throne, while others mourned for the sons who had died in the great hall. The island buzzed with conflicting emotions, joy and sorrow, celebration and grief, hope for the future, and regret for the past. In the days that followed, Odysseus worked to heal the wounds that the suitors' presence had left on his kingdom. He made peace with the families of the dead, offering compensation where possible and justice where necessary. It was difficult work, for a king must balance mercy with firmness, and some wounds take time to heal. He was reunited with his father, old Laertes, who had withdrawn to a farm outside the city, growing vegetables and tending his trees in lonely exile. The old man's joy at seeing his son alive was beyond description, and for a moment it seemed that his years fell away, and he was young again. But perhaps the sweetest moments were those he spent alone with Penelope, learning about the years they had been apart, and sharing the stories of his adventures. She told him of Telemachus's childhood, of the struggles she had faced as a single ruler, of the long nights when she had sat by her window watching for ships that never came. He told her of his wanderings, of the monsters and gods he had encountered, of the comrades he had lost and the friends he had made. But mostly he told her that through all his adventures, through all the temptations and distractions he had faced, the thought of her had been his constant companion and his guiding star. As the months passed and order was restored to Ithaca, Odysseus began to understand that his journey was not yet complete. Tiresias had spoken truly when he prophesied that the hero must travel inland with an oar until he found people who knew nothing of the sea. So it was that one day, when spring had come to Ithaca and the island was green with new growth, Odysseus kissed his wife farewell and set out on his final journey. He carried with him an oar from his ship, and he walked steadily inland, away from the sea that had been both his highway and his enemy. He traveled through mountains and valleys, across rivers and plains, until he came to a land where the people had never seen the ocean or tasted salt fish. When an old farmer looked at his oar and asked what manner of winnowing fan it might be, Odysseus knew he had found the place the prophet had described. There, in that distant valley, he built an altar to Poseidon and made the sacrifices that would finally appease the sea god's anger. As the smoke of the offerings rose toward the heavens, He felt a great weight lift from his shoulders, the burden of divine wrath that he had carried for so many years. The Earth-Shaker himself appeared then, terrible and magnificent, his beard flowing like waves, and his eyes flashing like lightning on water. But when he spoke, his voice held no anger, only the satisfaction of justice finally served. "Odysseus," Poseidon said, "you have paid the price for the harm you did to my son, and you have learned the lessons that the gods meant to teach you. Go now in peace, and may your remaining years be filled with the happiness you have earned through suffering." With these words, the god vanished like mist, and Odysseus knew that his wandering days were truly over. He could return to Ithaca, to Penelope, to the kingdom that waited for his rule, knowing that no divine curse would follow him. The journey home seemed to take no time at all, as if the very earth were eager to speed him back to where he belonged. When he came over the hill that looked down on his palace, when he saw the smoke rising from the familiar chimneys and the olive groves silver in the afternoon light, his heart swelled with a joy too deep for words. Penelope was waiting for him in their chamber, sitting by the window where she had watched for his return so many times before. When she saw him coming up the path, she ran to meet him, and their reunion was as sweet as their first meeting had been so many years before. They lived together in contentment for many years after that, ruling Ithaca with wisdom and justice, watching Telemachus grow into a fine king in his own right, and finding in each other the love that had sustained them through 2 decades of separation. When death finally came to Odysseus, it was gentle as Tiresias had promised, a peaceful ending to a life that had known more adventure than any man has a right to expect. He died in his own bed, surrounded by those he loved, his hand clasped in Penelope's, his last words a whisper of her name. But his story did not die with him. It lived on in the songs of bards, in the tales told around winter fires, in the dreams of those who yearn for home, and the courage of those who face impossible odds. For Odysseus had proven that with cunning and courage, with faith and perseverance, even the longest journey can lead to home. His name became a byword for cleverness and endurance, for the kind of heroism that triumphs not through strength alone, but through wit and will. Children grew up hearing of his adventures, and sailors invoked his name when storms threatened their ships. The wine-dark sea still stretches between distant shores, and heroes still arise to face the challenges that fate sets before them. But none have surpassed the fame of Odysseus, the man of many wiles, who found his way home across the vast waters through cunning and courage and love. As the ancient poet sang, and as we remember still in this gentle evening hour, there is no greater glory for a man than that which he wins by his own hands and feet. May you, dear listener, find in your own journey the wisdom to know when to fight and when to yield, the courage to face whatever monsters await, and most of all, the love that calls you home across whatever dark waters you must cross. For in the end, it is not the destination that matters most, but the strength we find within ourselves to continue the journey, and the love that lights our way through the darkness toward the shores of home. Sleep now, and may your dreams be filled with fair winds and following seas, carrying you safely toward whatever dawn awaits.